Great, thank you for joining me today. I'm so excited to be presenting to you all, and thanks for the invitation to be here. So my name is Brianna Blaser. I work at the University of Washington with a program called Access Computing. And today we're going to be talking about ways to make online meetings and presentations accessible to people with disabilities. So without further ado, let's get started. So Access Computing has been funded by the National Science Foundation since 2006. We're one of the broadening participation in computing alliances. And we work to increase the participation of people with disabilities in computing education and careers. So our strategies include both institutional change and direct interventions. So in terms of institutional change, we work directly with computing departments across the country, as well as computing organizations, to think of ways to make their activities and their organizations more welcoming and accessible to people with disabilities. And then we also work directly with students with disabilities themselves. So we do a lot of mentoring and career development activities with those students, as well as offering funding for things like participating in conferences, REUs, and other internships. So, and we have tons of resources on our websites related to accessibility of computing education and careers. So I invite you to check that out, uw.edu/accesscomputing. And we're always looking for more folks to get involved. So if you're interested, look us up and get involved. Well, great. So when we think about ability and disability, we all have a variety of abilities of things that we are more or less able to do, right? So ability is on a spectrum. We are more or less able to do things like see or hear, to walk, to read print, to communicate verbally, to tune out distractions, to learn, or to manage our physical or mental health, right? So if you think about these abilities, when it starts to, your inability to do something impacts a major life function, then it rises to the level to become a disability, right? That's the definition used by the Americans with Disabilities Act, right? So somebody who uses glasses may not be able to see perfectly, but if they have sufficient vision, it's not a disability. So in the context that we're talking about today, if we're thinking about meetings and presentations, what sort of disabilities might cause there to be barriers for your participation? So certainly I think about folks that are blind or visually impaired. So is the meeting software accessible? Do you have access to an electronic version of a PowerPoint presentation? All of those sorts of things will definitely affect somebody who's blind or visually impaired. Deaf or hard of hearing folks might need sign language interpreting or captioning to be able to participate. And then folks who have attention or learning related disabilities might benefit from a variety of strategies to help organize the information. And certainly there are other disabilities that might impact your participation in a meeting or presentation, but just an idea of some of the things that might arise. And the thing that I think is particularly interesting is that some of the strategies that we'll talk about that benefit folks with disabilities also benefit some folks with non-disability related barriers to participating in meetings and presentations, right? So one group I think of is non-native speakers of English who may be unfamiliar with the language that somebody is using. I also think about folks that connect via phone to a virtual meeting, right? So often you can connect via phone and not even have the visual content of, say, a Zoom meeting. So if you aren't participating in the visual thing, you don't know who's part of the meeting right now. You can't see any presentations that are shared. So what can you do as you're running that meeting or giving that presentation to make sure those folks that may only be able to participate on the phone have access to the same amount of information? So we talk a lot about the strategy called universal design. So universal design originally originated in the built environment and architecture, but now is applied in a variety of environments, including instruction and learning. And universal design refers to the design of products and environments to be usable by all people to the greatest extent possible without the need for adaptation or specialized design. So you're thinking about the wide variety of folks that might be participating in your meeting or presentation and what you can do to make sure that that wide variety of folks is able to participate. So a classic example of universal design is the curb cut, right? So that the sidewalk has the little ramp that goes down to the street, so you can easily, if you're using a wheelchair, get onto the sidewalk. And this picture on this slide is a drawing based on a photograph from the 1970s in the UW's daily newspaper, when folks were trying to get the university to ramp the curbs so that people with wheelchairs could access campus more easily. And you know, we all benefit from curb cuts, right? If you've ever been lugging a suitcase behind you, or you've been pushing a stroller, it's really nice to have that curb cut and not be, you know, trying to get something heavy up on the sidewalk, right? When we're thinking about education, when we're thinking about meetings and presentations, a better example of universal design would be captioning videos. So we know that there's a variety of folks that benefit from those captions, right? So those folks who are deaf or hard of hearing are benefiting from them. Some people with attention deficits will follow them and find that reading along helps them learn better. But we also know that folks who are non-native speakers of English benefit from captions. We also know that there are folks who might be in a loud environment and can't hear as well, or need to be particularly quiet, so they don't want to turn the volume up real loud, right? There's a variety of different settings in which you might use those captions. I like to think about universal design as being a really proactive approach. So a means of providing access that you might be more familiar with would be providing a particular accommodation to a particular participant with a disability that needs that accommodation to participate, right? So universal design is proactively thinking about who might be in the room and what can we do to make this experience better for them. So when we're thinking about an inclusive environment, we're trying to think about building an environment for our meeting or for our presentation that lets everyone participate, that makes everyone feel welcome, that engages everyone, and again, proactively considers those diverse needs. So I have another picture on here. This, my colleague Cheryl loves this example. And this is, again, another concrete example of something we do. Again, this is for an in-person meeting, but we think a lot about name tags. Right, so whenever we have name tags at a meeting, the first name is always very big on them because that's probably the most important part of what's on the name tag. So somebody who's further away or has not as clear vision can still read somebody's first name. They're always double-sided. I mean, how often are you at a meeting and somebody's name tag flips over and you have no idea who they are and you have to have that little dance of, can you flip your name tag over? So, you know, some of that applies to what's actually on the name badge, but then our name badges always have the lanyard, they always have a clip, and they always have a pin. Based on somebody's mobility needs, based on what they're wearing, they may want to use any one of those on any given day, right? So it thinks about the variety of needs somebody might have. So as we're thinking about presentations, we're going to think about a couple different stages. We're going to think about what you're doing to prepare. We'll think about presentation materials, videos. We'll talk a little bit about delivery, and then following up with folks afterwards. So before you have a meeting, one thing I want to point out is that not all meeting software is accessible. So you may want to look into whether what your university or organization uses is particularly accessible. There are more and less accessible tools out there. So if a tool isn't accessible, that might mean it doesn't play well with captioning. It might mean that somebody who is a screen reader user can't easily access portions of the meeting, say a chat function. So figure out whether your software is accessible. Figure out the accessibility features and share those with participants. When you're running a meeting, I always like to have somebody designated to manage the meeting. So they're managing the chat, they're looking at the participant list, doing any of that sort of moderation so that the person who is presenting can focus on their presentation and their own attention isn't divided. As you're inviting folks, make it clear how participants can request accommodations. So if you're advertising it, you can have an email address where folks can email and ask about accommodations. If people are registering, it could be a spot on the registration form that asks about any accommodations that folks might need. Commonly in online meetings and presentations, I would expect things like captioning, sign language interpretation, and potentially electronic versions of the presentation. Those are going to be the most commonly seen things. And this seems almost silly to say, but after somebody's made a request, The important thing is to respond to that request, right? So often when I'm talking with people with disabilities, they'll say, you know, I requested sign language interpreting at this meeting, but I never heard anything from them. Or, you know, I need, you know, in an in-person event, I need a guide because I'm blind and I'm in an unfamiliar venue. And so they'll request it, but they never hear back to find out that they're going to get that accommodation. So, you know, shooting off a quick email that says, great, we'll get this set up, thanks for letting us know, is all that person needs to feel more confident and comfortable going into the meeting that they're going to be able to participate equitably. Consider recording your presentation. There's a couple benefits to recording. Of course, you might be able to share it with folks who are unable to attend, but also there are folks who might want to go back and reference the recording because they missed a part. The other thing you can consider is whether you want to make slides available in advance. So both last year and this year, I've been the accessibility chair for the Tapia Celebration of Diversity in Computing. And one of the things we've done is to ask all of the presenters in every session to upload electronic versions of their slides that are then made available to participants. And the motivation behind this was making sure that folks who needed those presentations, either because of a vision-related disability or a learning-related disability or whatnot, had those electronic versions to access. But in doing it, we found that so many more people in the community wanted those presentations as well, because it helped them prepare, it helped them follow up and find resources and links that they didn't jot down during the session, or even it helped them learn about a session they weren't able to go to because of a scheduling conflict. So we've really had a large response, a positive response to doing that, and largely folks have been more than willing to post their slides as well. As you're designing your presentation, there's a few things we like to encourage folks to think about. Use a high contrast color scheme. If you're not sure if the colors you're using are sufficiently high contrast, there are color checkers online that you can use, but you know, things like don't use a light colored font on a white background or red on blue or you know, anything like that. Make sure to use large fonts. Keep the text brief and graphics simple. If there's too much text on a slide, you're asking folks to read instead of listening to what you're hearing or listening to what you're saying. Ensure that you're using more than just color coding to communicate information, right? So you're thinking in that instance about folks who might be colorblind. And then think about using short URLs. So you can provide a short URL that links to the slides online. You can also use short URLs throughout the presentation rather than putting long, unwieldy URLs on a slide that folks are then trying to jot down while you're talking. If you're using videos, I highly encourage you to think about captioning them. You can upload a video to YouTube and then edit the captions that it generates. There's a variety of strategies to make captions for videos. So for how-to instructions on that, I highly encourage you to check out the UW's website. So uw.edu/accesscomputing. And that talks about a variety of ways that you can generate captions. So like I said, there are these automatic captioning tools. YouTube will automatically generate captions, but they're not always particularly accurate. So you want to make sure to edit those captions. And if you're reading along with the captions, I'm using Google Slides captioning tool. If you're reading along with them here, you'll see places that they just have totally the wrong word. And you know, these tools have gotten a lot better over the past few years, but they're still far from perfect. So I encourage folks to edit those. The other thing that you might want to think about with videos is audio description. So this is a little bit less common, but audio descriptions help somebody who's blind or visually impaired to access the visual content where they otherwise may not know what's going on the screen. So particularly, you know, I used to work for this organization that had this really great inspirational video about the organization, but it was completely silent except for inspirational music. If a blind person was in the audience when that video was playing, they're not going to know anything about the organization, right? They're not going to benefit from all of that information that is there. So an audio description of what was in the video could have made it much more interesting and useful to somebody who's blind or visually impaired. So I'm going to pull up an example of audio description, just in case you've never seen this.
Matt McGarity, Senior Lecturer.
As teachers, we're really now entering in a time where our content's available in so many different ways on so many different platforms.
Department of Communications.
And we are not servicing so many of our students if we're not increasing accessibility. And captioning is one of the most important ways that we can be doing that. And the fact that we now have the technological tools to do it.
University of Washington.
If we don't, we're missing out on a huge opportunity. And we're actually missing out on what I would see as one of the missions of the university, to increase access.
Screens scroll by. Students watch media with captions including social media graphics, resources, and people lecturing. Words appear. Captions, improving access to post-secondary education.
Great, so you can see there that the audio description let you know who was speaking, what their background was, which were words that were appearing on a screen, but also described what was happening in that title screen, where otherwise you might not have had any idea what was happening. Great, so, and then I wanted to think a little bit about what do you need to do while you're delivering a presentation to make sure that it is accessible. So some examples of things you may not want to say during a presentation, pointing to a screen and saying, as you can see from this graph. Well, if you can't see that graph and then you just go on to talk about your conclusion, there's a lot of information left out. So describing what you're seeing in the graph and why that's pertinent would be beneficial. People will put up pictures behind them and they'll say something like, you never know who you'll meet. And there they are shaking hands with some famous person. Well, if everybody else in the room is laughing, that person who's blind again is going to be sitting there and thinking, huh, wonder what that was. Not to mention folks who may not know who the particular famous person was because they don't have that context. So again, just a simple sentence say, you never know who you'll meet. Like this day I met Barack Obama, right? It makes it it's just a simple thing, but it makes it much more accessible to a wide variety of folks. And then the other thing is using things like laser pointers or the pointing software in your online meeting tool and saying things like, as you can see right here, well, describe what you're pointing at for somebody who can't see that pointer. So what are some of the other things that we should think about? Think about turning on your camera. This is the same sort of advice we would give in person to face the audience so that somebody who benefits from lip reading can see you and see you talking. We encourage folks to speak all the content on your slides. Again, if you are just encouraging folks to read the slides and folks need to be able to read it, then somebody who's blind and can't see the slides, first of all, doesn't see that content, but you're also asking folks to divide their attention between what you're saying and what's on the slide. And it's hard to do multiple things at once. We encourage folks to pause after changing the slide. So somebody who is both looking at sign language interpreters, but is also trying to read the slides, can't look in those two different places at once. And often in online meetings, somebody who's deaf will have multiple devices set up so that they can see their sign language interpreters and see the presentation. And so giving them a second to look at the slide before they need to look back to their sign language interpreter can increase their access. Speak clearly. Use a microphone or a headset. When I talk to some of my colleagues that are hard of hearing, they talk about how much better the audio quality is when somebody uses a headset. And it doesn't have to be a complicated one. I'm just using the free headphones that came with my iPhone. And that seems to work well enough for folks I work with. Make sure to use understandable terms. So try to avoid jargon that's gonna make it harder for folks to access what you're sharing. Be sure to verbally describe images and graphics. So that's what a lot of those examples on the previous slide were. And then think about using multiple instructional methods. So different folks will learn better in different environments. So think about, can you use a poll? Can you encourage discussion in the chat? Or can you use breakout rooms for small group discussion during your meeting to help folks engage with the material in different ways? And then consider using automatic captioning tools. So both Google Slides and PowerPoint have automatic captioning tools that you can turn on for a presentation. So I have them turned on today. And you can see they're not perfect, but they're providing some form of captions for this presentation. I will note that you have to have it running on the computer that you are presenting from. So if somebody else was doing this presentation, I was connected to them on Zoom, when they were talking, captions wouldn't necessarily be generated. And it does rely on an internet connection too. But it's a simple way that's free to provide captions to a meeting. So I encourage you to experiment with that. Try it and see how it works for you. And then thinking about how you're responding to your audience members. Let folks know when you'll respond. Do you want to take questions during the presentation or at the end? You know, in person, one of the things we'd encourage folks to do is use a handheld mic and pass that around, or make sure to repeat questions from the audience. You know, some of that strategy may not be as applicable online, but if you're answering questions from the chat, making sure to read the question aloud can really benefit folks. And also make it clear how you want questions to be asked. So when you're in an online meeting or you're in a presentation, you know, can people ask questions via the chat? Can they ask them verbally? Do you want folks to use the hand raising function if they're going to be asking them verbally? And communicating to folks clearly how to do each of those things and access those things. Certainly if you're encouraging folks to ask questions in the chat, you want to know that the tool that you're using has an accessible chat that folks who are blind and visually impaired using screen readers can access. And then following up, you know, after a presentation, it's a great idea to make the slides available with clickable links and make sure that those slides are available in an accessible format. So again, uw.edu/accessibility will have information about how to make presentations accessible. And if, you know, if it's a meeting where you have everybody's contact information, you can directly email slides or email a link to the recording afterwards to folks who participated. And then gather feedback about accessibility, particularly if you know there were participants there who were utilizing accommodations. Ask them how it worked for them. Get some feedback about what you can do better in the future. The other thing to think about, of course, in terms of presentations is posters. I know a lot of folks are given posters in online meetings too. You know, similar suggestions would apply in terms of formatting. Things about using a large font, leaving white space. Thinking about captioning or titling graphics, particularly if folks are looking at your poster when you're not there to present it. And then I love the idea of suggesting questions on your poster. For somebody who may be unfamiliar with some of the jargon, or for somebody who is a little bit anxious, saying questions, you know, ask me about my methods, ask me about my future directions. Those sorts of things can be conversation starters that can lead to a rich conversation. But give that person a nudge. And you know, you can also do that to ask some leading questions to help you answer questions you're more comfortable with. So I just wanted to wrap up and share some resources that we have. So again, uw.edu/accesscomputing is the URL for our program. And on there you can search for a couple resources that have more of the hints and tips that I've been sharing today. So one is called Accessibility and Universal Design of Online Meetings. Another one is called Equal Access Universal Design of Your Presentation. So if we're always looking for more folks to get involved. So we're looking for participants who have disabilities and want to get involved with our mentoring. We're looking for partners who may want to change their computing department or organization, and folks maybe that want to be a member of our community of practice and just stay up to date on things related to disability and accessibility and computing. And there's tons of resources on our website too that you can check out. So, and if you have any questions, I invite you to email me at blaser@uw.edu. Thanks, have a great day, bye.